Hello, everybody out there in the world of Twitch. I'm Carlos A.S. Lising, and welcome to the newest episode of caslTawk. I am super pleased to have as my guest here for our eighth episode, Mr. Lawrence Schick. Mr. Lawrence Schick, how you doing tonight?
Hey, gamers. I'm doing fine. It's a really nice night here in Dublin, Ireland. It's real calm and cool. We're having a lovely spring. It's about to rain for the next 2 weeks.
Oh, wow. Wow. There's a reputation. There's certain reputation that comes with the Irish, the springtime. So, absolutely. Thanks again for coming with us today. As everyone out there knows, Mr. Schick has a long and illustrious career in role-playing games. He's at least in part responsible for such seminal work as the Slave Lord series that everyone knows and loves, Convention Play, for some of your first Convention Play games, White Plume Mountain, which is probably one of the World of Greyhawk's absolute masterpieces, an introduction to the puzzle dungeon sort of style of play. He's an author for Heroic Worlds, his own book. He's been an executive for AOL. He's worked in computer games. Mr. Schick has done just about everything, seen everything as far as role-playing game goes, and pretty much far beyond that. Mr. Schick, right now, could you tell me a little bit about what kind of current projects you're doing?
Well, currently, up until about 14 months ago, I had been for a long time, almost 10 years. I had been with ZeniMax on as one of the lead writers and the lore master on the Elder Scrolls Online. And a bit over a year ago, I left that gig and went back into small game development. I'm currently working for a small studio in Dublin called War Ducks, where I'm working on a mobile game, designing and writing and managing and doing all the stuff that I've done in the past, but with a small team. It's a lot of fun getting back into the entrepreneurial environment and doing small-scale consumer software. I'm also on the side, besides being Lawrence Schick, I'm also Lawrence Ellsworth, the historical fiction author and editor and translator. So I'm in the middle of my current big project is I'm editing and translating all new editions of Alexander Dumas' entire Musketeers series. This is my version of the Three Musketeers. It's been out for a couple of years, and the latest one, book 3 in the series, 20 years after, just came out last fall. These are available from Pegasus Books in the U.S. and the U.K. And that series is ongoing. That's eventually, by the time we get through The Man in the Iron Mask, it'll be 8 volumes. And by that time, hopefully, the game that we're working on for War Ducks will be out there, and millions of people will be playing it. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
That is the Schick phone right over there. For those of you guys who haven't, it's obvious that the Lords of Role Playing is just as interested in hearing him speak as I am. Mr. Schick, why Dumas in particular?
I got interested in Dumas mainly after I first saw the Richard Lester Three Musketeers and Four Musketeers movies back in the early 70s. So that just became one of my interests. And then in the late 80s and the early 90s, I was into a lot of theater style live action role playing LARPs on the East Coast. And I had a group at that time while I was working at Microprose. We had a troupe called Cruel Hoax Productions, and we specialized in weekend-long LARPs that were for 60 to 100 players, theater style, which means that you're in a hotel all weekend and you're acting everything out. You're not whacking people with like Nerf swords and stuff. We had invented romance rules for LARPs, and so we had a large constituency of players who were both male and female, and so we were looking for another subject for our next game. And I remembered the Musketeers and that period and how many strong female characters there were.
Oh, for sure.
so we wrote a game called The King's Musketeers that is still occasionally put on by groups today. And I just got really involved in the period and decided, when I get around to writing historical fiction, I think I'll write stuff in this period. So I started researching it and realized that I needed to learn French because I wanted to be able to read Richelieu's memoirs in the original, because you can't find them in English. So I have a knack for languages, so I learned French, and eventually this is getting too long because this is not about.
Not at all. I want to know everything there is to know about the Lawrence Schick experience. So please.
I was researching. Doing my own sort of parallel novel to The Three Musketeers, and I kept running across references to a Musketeers novel, a sequel that Dumas had written late in his career, but that wasn't available. There was no extant version in English, and it was long out of print. It had long been out of print in France, and I did further research and found out that part of the issue was it was like the next to last novel that he wrote, and he hadn't completed it. So it was an unfinished, late career Musketeers sequel novel, and I thought, geez, I gotta find this. And I couldn't find any copies of the book in the States. I finally tracked it down in 2 volumes in paperback in France, in Paris, actually, in an antique store for 1 volume, and in one of the bouquiniste stalls along the Seine for the other. And
it's so evocative just hearing you say that. I mean, I can just so totally imagine you strolling down the Seine there, looking at with your beret on.
No, I look goofy in a beret. So, but anyway, I found this book, the Comte de Mornay, or the Red Sphinx, and read it on the way back, and it was quite good. It was vintage Dumas, but it didn't have an ending. And so I did further research, and I found that Dumas had written a standalone novelette about 15 years earlier in the 1850s that was about 2 of the main protagonists of the Red Sphinx. And it basically completed their romantic story. And so it was like, oh, look, here is an end to the novel just by standing alone by itself. You know what? If I translated this and put these 2 things together, we'd have a complete Dumas Musketeers novel that nobody had before. I wonder why nobody's done it. So then I was in a big hurry to do it because I was sure somebody else was going to do it first. But they didn't. And we got it out several years ago under the title The Red Sphinx in the US and the UK from Pegasus Books. And a reconstructed, unknown sequel to The Three Musketeers. And it did quite well. So the publisher said, geez, let's do the whole series. Or I actually twisted their arm and said, we should do the whole series. And so that's what I'm doing as my side project when I'm not game designing. I'm translating Alexander Dumas from 170 years ago.
That is absolutely amazing. I mean, for myself, my background as in college, my minor is in literature with a concentration in Russian poetry. So I'm familiar with reading a lot from the original language. It's not necessarily an easy task. A lot of concepts don't necessarily cross over super well. So that's a very daunting task what you did, but I think it's amazing that you could revivify something like that for a new generation. I mean, that to me, I kind of think of what you did there as, I remember when they realized that there was a Dune book that was out there that Herbert hadn't quite finished, and his son took over. It's something similar to me.
Or Christopher Tolkien, finishing the J.R.R. Tolkien's
what about Dumas' style or his actual themes appeal to you?
Well, of course, he's one of the hallmark authors of the swashbuckling style of the 19th century romantics, right? So everything in a Dumas novel is larger than life.
Right.
All the characters are big. They don't do anything by halves. Whenever there's something to be done, they throw themselves into it. The characters of the Four Musketeers are archetypal. Even if you have not ever read the novel, just through it, the Musketeers stories percolating through popular culture, you pretty much have a grasp of who D'Artagnan, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis are. And they're really immortal characters, and they each represent a different piece of Dumas' own personality, which you can read all about in the introduction to my versions of his novels.
And I would like to, this is a perfect segue into this. Everybody that wants to go out there and support Mr. Schick's work, I encourage you to go out there, go to Amazon.com or wherever fine books are sold, and you can pick up copies of this. And they're looking for the author's name one more time.
Lawrence Ellsworth.
Okay.
Ellsworth, because that was my mother's
Facebook feed and my Twitch feed and my YouTube feed. I'll make sure that I include a link to that, because actually this was breaking news to me until just before the show. I didn't really realize that you were also the mysterious Lawrence Ellsworth. Very cool stuff.
Look for the Red Sphinx, because there's so many versions of the Three Musketeers that it's hard to pick that one out of the crowd on first look. But the Red Sphinx is only my version, so you can go from there.
Awesome.
Okay, how about that?
As far as Casl Entertainment goes, from my perspective right now, I'm working on Patreon stuff. For those of you who support my Patreon, we're doing, I just finished up a bunch of character sheets for it. I got some really cool stuff for you. Next month is Halfling Month. So you guys will be able to get a bunch of new Halfling-related magic items, monsters, spells, characters, and I've got an entire Halfling-based mini module called caslTawk out there that I think you guys will really like. There's not a whole lot that's just Halfling-specific out there for D&D, and I think that for those of you who appreciate the demi-human race, I think you'll really like what I've done. And I also did last night, I was working on a little bit of our charity module that we're going to be doing, Tears That Forever Stain, and that will be probably out there in September for those of you who are interested in joining in on the charity. I think that'll be really cool. It'll be it's my personal passion, which is Cheetah Conservation Fund. So we're going to be partnering directly with the charity this time around, and it should be really cool. I plan on doing it for an entire week. You'll be able to buy the module digital and hardcover format, digital and physical format. And I've got a lot of really cool stuff planned for that. So you guys can look forward to that coming up. But you guys don't really want to hear about Casl Entertainment right now. Let's talk more about Mr. Schick right now. Mr. Schick, as I introduced him, a lot of you guys know him as he's one of TSR's contributors from the company's, during really when the ascension of the company from just a games company to a cultural touchstone in America. You've touched millions of lives with your work all across the world. You've created some of the most beloved adventures that we've got out there. I know everybody would like to hear a little bit about your past with with TSR, and with a little bit some of your anecdotes and stories about things that happened with that. So could you tell us a little bit about before TSR even begins, your early life and background?
Okay. This was all long ago, before the earth cooled. I was before D&D. I was already a fantasy fan and a science fiction fan. My father had grown up reading the American pulp magazines, so he had known all about Weird Tales and about the hero pulps and Edgar Rice Burroughs and writers of that ilk. And in the 1960s, there was a huge boom in paperback reprints of the original stuff that had appeared in American pulps in the 20s and 30s and 40s. Started to be reprinted in the paperbacks in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And my father would buy those and pass them on to me, and then I would read them. So I got to know Conan the Barbarian and H.P. Lovecraft's works, and Clark Ashton Smith, and Fritz Leiber, and all the great sword and sorcery authors. Well before, basically all the stuff that's in Appendix N in the Dungeon Master's Guide, I had read. So when, and also my father had always had an interest in games. And so as a child, we always played games in the family. He even introduced me to war games. He found the first 1964 Avalon Hill edition of Gettysburg, the one with the squares before they even had hexes on the map, and brought that home, and turned me into a war gamer as well. I was designing my own miniatures games using Mark's toys and stuff like that, and dice rules adapted from Risk. So when role-playing games came along in 1974, 75, at that time, I was like a freshman or sophomore in college at Kent State University in Ohio. This was a huge revelation. My friend Tom Moldvay, who, we were sort of co-running the Kent State University Science Fiction Club. He went off to a convention somewhere, some little Ohio SF fan con, and came back with photocopied pages of most of white box D&D. And it was missing the parts that whoever photocopied it, because at that time it was like 10 cents a page. That was expensive. Didn't think was important. So we had what was in there. We had most of it, and we had to figure out the rest for ourselves. And eventually we got our own copy of OD&D, as it's called now, and passed that around. But that was quite a revelation, because here was a way of storytelling with a group, with friends, and it used game systems. So it was a way of quantifying stories with, and I was already all over storytelling. I had taught myself how to type on a manual typewriter, and I was a gamer, and these combined the two. And so pretty much that was just it. That was like, this is the thing I want to do, because this combines all my interests. Tom and I took to running, sort of tag team running D&D campaign in Kent and Akron, using the world that eventually became the known world that eventually became Mystara. And so we were like co-GMs. We would take turns GMing with a sort of rotating cast of players from Kent and Akron. And our goal was to create a fantasy world that everybody could sort of participate in, and you could all play together in. It was going to be a cooperative world rather than a single designer world like Tolkien's Middle Earth or something. And so that was the origin of the known world. Then we, as the 70s progressed, and role-playing games started to become a more than just a niche or fringe fan thing. They started to actually be published by in bound copies that you could buy in hobby stores if you were lucky enough to have a hobby store near you, or by mail order if you were brave enough to mail order something that you had didn't know sight unseen whether it was going to be any good or not. So that started to develop, and so that started to look like something, maybe a guy could do that. Then in like late 1978, TSR advertised for a designer, and write directly to Gary Gygax with your samples. So I did, and that's that's how we got there. Okay, time for you to ask a question.
Sounds good, man. I could have listened to that for another hour, so I was totally fine with that. Something that I find really interesting, there's a lot of different roads that now that you can take into the role-playing industry. Back then, everything was so much more direct. I assume that Tom also Moldvay sent his samples in at the same time with you.
Oh no, he was more interested in going the trad science fiction and fantasy author route.
Uh-huh.
So he wasn't that keen initially. It wasn't until I went in and broke the ice and showed that it could be done that then TSR started to really take off. They needed to staff up.
Right.
And I knew a guy, so that's how when we were hiring, and we hired Zeb Cook, and we hired Tom, and other folks around the same time, all came in, and Steve Marsh joined us for a while, and then Frank Menser came in, and so that was when we were building the staff, and that's how. Tom, even though he was several years older than I, this was one case where I had actually gone and broken trail ahead of him, and he followed up.
It's the entrepreneurial spirit in you that it seems to underscore a lot of the stories that you have, is that you're a trailblazer and an innovator. Something I want to mention. Did you relocate? Actually, this chat, by the way, is being broadcast from about an hour from where you're mentioning in Kent State. We're up in Painesville, Ohio, just north of you. But what did you relocate to Lake Geneva at that point in time?
I did. I relocated with my fiance in a rented truck to a job from Ohio in the middle of the winter in Wisconsin for minimum wage.
Oh, brutal, brutal. Now you show up in Lake Geneva. You're there. You just started work for a new company. You're meeting Gary Gygax for the first time. What were your first impressions of the man? What was he like as a boss?
Gary was a lot like a Dumas character. He was larger than life. He didn't do anything by halves. So he was obviously very much of a raconteur, a storyteller, and a funny guy with a great sense of humor, and very well read, albeit entirely self-taught. But he was also, because he had come out of wargaming, he was a very competitive person. He wanted to have his way, and there was no two ways about that. So, it was immediately apparent that he was the driving force, at least creatively, at that time in the company, and that the rest of us were going to follow his lead for as long as he was willing to do the leading, which wasn't forever. He got interested off in his own things, and basically after the sort of the trilogy of AD&D hardcovers, Monster Manual, and then Player's Handbook, and then Dungeon Master's Guide. After those three were published, he kind of felt like he deserved to sit in his laurels and, to a certain extent, take a break. So after that point, he did a lot of piecemeal work, and he did direction of where things ought to go. At that point, it was up to the staff to kind of pick up and become the professional publishing arm that TSR became, turning out vast quantities of scenarios and rule books and associated other materials, well into the 80s.
Some of our, I'd like to, at this point in time, I'd like to mention some of our viewers out there. We've got a pretty good audience right now for this time slot. Gaetano, I've got one of Lake Geneva's own right over here, a fellow Chicagoan, Mark Clover is over here watching today. Jason Zavoda, Gaetano, thank you very much for tuning in and seeing Mr. Schick and I speak. What do you remember what your first assignments were that you got from TSR?
Oh, yes. My first assignment, when I walked in the door, Gary handed me a cardboard box that had hundreds of pages of the typescript for the Dungeon Master's Guide in it. And he said, well, here's our next book. It's not all done, and it's not organized. So go put this together. Make some sense out of this. Organize this. It's kind of a rough table of contents on top. There's parts here that are just kind of sketched in. Finish those. And there's some stuff. It's going to need stuff in the end. Do some appendices, and then before you do anything big, though, check back with me. So that was my first job, which was if I hadn't had the player's handbook to kind of show me a way to go, and if that hadn't been done so capably by mainly by Mike Carr, it would have been entirely daunting. But as it was, I was young and cocksure, and I had that example, and so I said, sure, I'll just make this Dungeon Master's Guide, and I'll just put this right together for you, Gary. So I started doing that. It was quite a task. It was big. Obviously, it was larger than the previous two books put together. I think in word count, and it was. I'll tell you, its woeful lack of organization, or so it appears to me now, is I blame on my youthful inexperience. It could have been put together more sensibly, I suppose, than I put it together.
I've got some of the comments in Twitch right now speak to that. I've got one of my viewers says, one of you still poorly organized to this day, and then somebody comes right back, Gaetano, one of our most ardent supporters here mentions, fortunately, my mind works this way, so it wasn't so bad.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Does his mind work this way because it's convenient that it adapts to the book, or did the book help his mind work that way?
I think
I'll tell you one thing that I did for Dungeon Master's Guide that I was proud of was I looked at it and I said, geez, this is a giant reference book and it doesn't have an index. How the hell can you publish a reference book without an index? So I undertook doing the index. Everybody's like, Player's Handbook didn't have an index. Doesn't have an index? What are you talking about? I did that on my own time at home. Just to make sure the damn thing had an index, because you can't have a big reference book without an index. It's absurd. And so that's why the Dungeon Master's Guide has an index to both the DMG and the Player's Handbook, because it had to look back to the Player's Handbook, which had been published without one. And the excuse was, of course, players don't need an index, but the Dungeon Master does. So that's why the Dungeon Master's Guide got an index and sort of set the standard for that.
Okay, you're looking back at the DMG right now as a document, and for many of us, including myself, and I'm sure I could speak for a lot of the audience right now, it was such a formative document. I mean, it's teaching me how to reference things. It's got a lot of Baroque architecture. There's no question, but at the same time, it taught me so much. What kind of things do you look back on in that project, and are you most proud of, besides the index? And things that you wish you could have a do-over on?
Well, as far as Gary had, in fact, for the first time in the Dungeon Master's Guide, started putting in guidance for not just players, but for the Dungeon Master, because that's the hardest job. Previous books hadn't particularly included much guidance. They were just rule books. And Gary started putting in stuff about, how does this actually work? out there in the live with people sitting around a table. How does it work? So I took from his example and started fleshing that kind of stuff out. The example of play, for example, that's in the Dungeon Master's Guide, with Gary's approval, I wrote that because it didn't have one. And I felt like it ought to have, let's give an example of what this sounds like and what this feels like, and so that players who are coming to this cold, this new art form that didn't exist before, how does this work? So we did the example of play, and that became a standard thing. I'm not sure the Dungeon Master's Guide did it first. It might have been done first in a Chaosium title or something, but it was certainly the first time that TSR did it. Some other stuff. Certainly in the back, is I did that great big multi-page table of all of the monster stats for a quick reference.
Oh, I'm bless you for doing that. As a designer, bless you for doing that.
Oh, well, delighted to hear that somebody actually got use out of that. And that was the first place in AD&D that ever used the phrase "to hit armor class 0," which I saw, I believe, in a Judges Guild product, if I remember correctly, and said, "There's a good idea." We put that in there. It didn't become generally adopted, of course, until second edition, but there you go. What would I have done differently? Like I said, organizationally, the book needs more sort of interstitial material, smoothing the thing along. It ought to have some sort of it ought to have some sort of framing device to walk people through it, who, like I said, were completely cold to the concept of how a tabletop role-playing game works, and it was still a brand new idea to 95% of gamers, and it needed to be. It could have been conveyed, I think, more clearly. I think that's the main thing.
Okay. I have a question from the audience from you. Someone mentions, one of our viewers, Shadzar, mentions that the afterword is the best guidance in the first edition DMG in their opinion. Was that Gary writing, or was that you?
I'm sorry, the afterword?
Yeah, the afterword.
What was it that? I don't have a copy.
I believe where the afterword mentions that you were talking about that the game is yours as a DM, and that you're ruling, you shouldn't be hemmed in by rules lawyers, I believe is what he's referring to.
Gary wrote that, and that was one of the things that actually inspired me to write some of the earlier some of the introductory material earlier in some of the other sections, because he had already written that. That was in the original manuscript.
Yeah,
that was, as I said, one of the things that inspired me to say, he's right. This is a thing that needs more attention.
The quote exactly is, "It is the spirit of the game, not the letter of the rules, which is important. Never hold to the letter written, nor allow some barracks room lawyer to force quotations from the rulebook upon you. If it goes against the obvious intent of the game, as you hew the line with respect to conformity to major systems and uniformity of play in general, also be certain that the game is mastered by you and not by your players. Within the broad parameters given in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons volumes, you are the creator and final arbiter. By ordering things as they should be, the game as a whole first, your campaign next, and your participants thereafter, you will be playing Dungeons & Dragons as it was meant to be. May you find as much pleasure in doing so as the rest of us do."
Yeah, that's all Gary. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you, that exhortation is something that we on the staff, on the design and development staff, took to heart, and really wanted to convey through the subsequent products to players. It was a little. So it caught us up a little bit short, then when Gary, who loved to make outrageous pronouncements, would contradict himself
Right.
About that sort of thing, and made it a little rough on us because we were trying to hew to the spirit of that statement.
Mm-hmm. Now you've moved just now to Lake Geneva. Now you have a preconceived notion, having played the game several times. Being a hobbyist first, from Akron and I would guess Eastern Ohio, Central Eastern Ohio. Um, what do you were you learning things constantly about the game at that point? Were there anything that surprised you? It was was a revelation to you when you showed up?
Uh, uh, don't forget, at that point, at the time that I showed up, which was January of 1979,
Hmm.
um, uh, the game had been out for over 4 years, and that's a long time. That's a lot of play,
Right.
and certainly Tom and I have been playing it since almost after its release, and there had been a great deal of it. It had instantly inspired a whole lot of fan activity, right? So that there were lots of fanzines being published. This was in lieu of the internet, which we have now.
Right.
Back then, it was all paper publication by mail. But there was a blizzard of opinion and ideas and different approaches. So that by the time that I got to TSR, they were already 2 books into the advanced D&D trilogy. It was pretty. You could see pretty well the lay of the land from Player's Handbook. They already had Mike Carr and Alan Hammock, the professionals on staff doing a good job. So it wasn't. It wasn't that there was anything that was like a blinding new revelation.
Right.
This was a stunningly new idea that was being interpreted in hundreds, if not thousands, of dining rooms, across the United States and in the UK, and it was already being played out and being beat on by a lot of folks. And there were already, by the time I got there were already competing products that were different and very solid and very interesting, that were coming from other publishers. So it was already a booming and blooming hobby. By the time I arrived, at least professionally, on the scene.
Now you're there again in Lake Geneva. You just showed up, and you're still at this point. Yeah, you're a professional, but you're also a hobbies enthusiast. Were you playing actually with the in the Lake Geneva campaign at that point in time, or did you kind of forestall gaming at that juncture?
Oh no, we were all fanatical gamers, and not just role playing games, because we had all been playing war games, what came to be called adventure games, before RPGs came along. So when we were playing games several nights a week, in different people's campaigns of different role playing games. We didn't play all just the TSR rule sets either. We played competing rule sets to see what was good about those.
Sure.
We played the games that TSR had published, like Mike Carr's Fight in the Skies, Brian Bloom's Boot Hill, and we played forthcoming games like the games of the Rahman brothers. I'm having a senior moment. Their fantasy board game, and Tramp's Titan, and Tom Wam's games. He was churning out games. He designed 10 games to every one that got published. There was everybody was playing everything.
I think people forget what a monster creator Tom was. I think a lot of people just associate him with Snit's Revenge and some cutesy artwork, but they miss the point with Tom. He's have gotten a chance to meet him a few times up at GaryCon myself. He's was a creative dynamo back then for sure. Um, Playing in those Lake Geneva games over there, you got a chance to play with Gary? What was his game like?
Actually, not very much. Gary had his own he had his own friends. He had his people who've been playing with him for some time, and by the time I got there, actually, he wasn't. If he was still running a regular game, it was something that was distinctly for friends and family. It wasn't for the new hires. He had his own circle, and that was we would see him running games mainly at like the small Lake Geneva conventions that were run in the shoulder seasons, the spring and fall. And then the big one, of course, was Gen Con in the summer. We weren't really playing that much with Gary.
One of my viewers over here is just mentioning that he's playing with Tom tomorrow. Actually, my friend Mark Clover, who lives up in Wisconsin right now. Him and Tom are getting to play tomorrow. I envy you, Mark. And also another one of my viewers is asking if the game you were referring to was Divine Right.
It was absolutely Divine Right. Yes, we love Divine Right, and if only it had sold better, because they also did a sequel that never got published. And it was quite good. Those were the Rahman brothers were enormously talented game designers who worked fantasy role playing aspects into their board games. Which had been there from the first with things like Dave McGarry's Dungeon and stuff.
Right. I just got a chance to play Dungeon when I was down at GrogCon last year, and I'd forgotten. It's been a long time since I played. I'd forgotten just how fun a game that was.
Yeah, no, it was genre defining. For one thing, it boiled out the essence of the dungeon crawl experience.
Mm-hmm.
And put it out there on a repeatable basis on a board that anybody could play. So it was a perfect way to sort of introduce the concept. That was brilliant. And I got a chance to work with Dave McGarry later on when I was at Coleco in the early days of video games.
We're going to get to your video game history here pretty soon. That's, again, one of the things I really admire about your career is how many different things you've done, and I think that I don't want to lose that. But there is one thing I do want to talk about first. This is caslTawk today, and as a result, I know a lot of people are here wanting to talk about the world of Greyhawk. This episode is entitled I Corrupt This, and the reason why is because I want to talk about this little gem right over here for a little while. I think you probably remember this one, White Plume Mountain. Tell me a little bit about White Plume Mountain, its genesis, where you, the whole development of it. How did you get the assignment to do it? Spill the beans on White Plume Mountain.
I didn't get the assignment to do it. White Plume Mountain was my my audition. The ad for that TSR had in 1978 for a designer for role-playing games for D&D said, send in samples. So at that point, Gary had published several of the original modules, the G series and the D series. So I looked at those and I said, okay, if I'm going to do a sample, I should do a sample that shows that I can work within the format that they have already established, because that's what they want to know. Can I do the stuff that they want to publish? So I said, how would I do that? So I had, like I said, I'd been running D&D games for 3.5 years, on and off with Tom Mulvey, and so I had this huge book full of old dungeons.
Okay.
So I said, some of the stuff in these old dungeons is pretty clever. I'll just go through and cherry pick all the good stuff, and I'll jam it all into one dungeon. And the point of it will be to show that I can do all of these different kinds of things, and that I can convey the way a dungeon works to players, and I'll show them that I know how to write, and I know how to map, and I know how to adapt stuff from other publications and fantasy worlds. I'll give them an imitation Stormbringer, so I took all my best stuff from 3+ years of designing dungeons and jammed them all into this funhouse dungeon. And it wasn't intended to be published. It was intended as an audition to show that I could do stuff that they could publish. They liked it well enough. I passed the audition. I came in with that, and Gary said, "Wow, this is really good. We're going to offer you this job, and not only that, but your sample dungeon that you did, the White Plume Mountain. We're going to publish that. We're not even going to change a word of it. We're just going to draw pictures and put it out, and that'll be S2. It'll follow right on S1. We needed another one in that series." And so that's where that came from, and that it's kind of a paragon of what 1970s D&Ding was like for a lot of people. Was all of these puzzle solving and it was still, it had its roots in a game, and it was very gamey. It wasn't about imitating novelistic storytelling like we did later. It was, and so that's where that came from. White Plume Mountain was my sample dungeon, my audition, and it was. A lot of the stuff in there is kind of goofy and self-indulgent because it just suited me, and I never thought they were going to publish it.
Yeah,
I figured, put in the jokes. I'm not going to publish this. I'm just showing them what I can do. So that's White Plume Mountain. That's my White Plume Mountain story.
I look down right now at my chat, and there are so many people with little anecdotes about White Plume Mountain and how much they love it, or mentioning certain traps in it. In particular, I've got one, where it's the chasm with the chained platforms, evil. And I remember the frictionless room was so brutal. I think the first time I ran it, we lost 3 or 4 PCs into that thing. That was horrible.
It's your fault.
Yeah, of course it was. I'm bad DMing, but you look back at it at White Plume Mountain. It's an enduring product. It defined a generation. I mean, it's one of the, whenever you mention something like Puzzle Dungeon, Funhouse Dungeon, things like that, White Plume Mountain is one of the first things on people's lips. You talk about some of your great classic Greyhawk modules. White Plume Mountain comes to mind right away. I believe it was 16 of all ranked of all the by Dungeon Magazine of all the dungeons that were out there, published modules. It's got to be something you're immensely proud of.
Well, yeah, I am. I'm glad that it happened to hit a nerve. I guess it came along and was just different enough from the other stuff that was being published, and it stood alone, so it was easy to incorporate into people's campaigns. I'm very pleased with it, but obviously I was in the right place at the right time, and I got lucky too.
I think that there's definitely something to be said for that. But I think that your talent, obviously, and your ability to problem solve. Being a hockey player, Gretzky, he often says hard work makes luck. So I think that there's a little bit, skill makes luck to some degree. I'm looking at some of the chat here, and somebody asked me, in retrospect, you wish that you'd changed anything in White Plume Mountain.
Oh, well, like I said, I didn't write it intending to be published. So if I thought it was going to be published, I would have attempted to make it more. I would have attempted certainly to make the writing more polished. Some of those jokes would have to go, uh, and it probably wouldn't have been as much fun because I would have tried to make it more of a serious and professional presentation than it was. Uh, to be quite honest, there's probably beloved jokes in there that I would have just said, kill your darlings, that's got to go.
I have to ask from my perspective. There's 3 artifact level weapons in there: Wave Whelm and Black Razor. Which one of them was your favorite?
Well, Well, uh, certainly, Black Razor, because I stole it, had a much stronger concept to it than Wave and Whelm, and they were sort of afterthoughts. Uh, once I had one artifact level intelligent weapon in there, it seemed like a tentpole idea that you could hang something on. So suddenly, it said, "Oh well, what if there's 3?" Because 3 is always the right number.
Right.
Whenever you're interviewing, I've interviewed thousands of people for game design jobs, in the last 40 years. Whenever you're interviewing somebody for a system designer, you just ask them straight out, all right, what's the perfect number? And if they don't say 3, you don't hire them. Because 3 is the right number for systems designs. And so, 3 was the right number to sort of to sort of give a structure to that dungeon where it didn't previously have one. So that's where those 3 came from.
If any of them saved anybody's life, I would have to think it was Wave more than anyone else, though, because of that cube of force ability and the nature of the room that it's in. Convert to Poseidon or die.
Well,
I have
yeah, I mean, a lot of the puzzles in there really didn't have an explicit solution to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like the room with the swinging discs. Good luck, pal. Just figure that one out for yourself.
Right.
But some of them, you try to put the answer to the puzzle right nearby, and so that players will grasp onto that and figure out what to do with it, because that's what makes players feel smart, right? And you want your players to feel smart, so help them to find the answer, and then they feel smart and they think you're smart too, and everybody's smart, and everybody, it's a good time.
I have 2 really good questions here from the audience, and one of them I've actually never even thought of before. But the first one is, how do you feel about White Plume Mountain being copied verbatim over to 5th edition and not even bothered to convert to the new rules for how things work, and being a cakewalk dungeon in Tales of the Yawning Portal?
Wow, that's not too many leading questions in there, is there?
No, I know.
I tell you what, we're hitting the hour point here, and I'm an old guy, so I'm going to think about that while you talk about cheetahs,
Okay.
And I'm going to go and mute my mic.
Perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. I think it's time to talk about cheetahs while Mr. Schick's away. That was an awesome question, actually, Shadzar, and I'm going to ask him the other one that you mentioned about Black Razor. Thanks for tuning in, Dan. I appreciate it. Mr. Schick, for me, I remember the day that I ran White Plume Mountain, the very first day I ran it. I ran it for a group of about 5 of my friends. It was one of the lunchtime games that I ran when I was in grade school. And it was a really... This module is 18, or is it 16? It is 16 pages long, okay? I probably, when I do a module design, when you see something from Casl Entertainment, I'm probably 6 to 7 times longer than that, and I've never written anything as fun as that. I mean, that module right over there was so evocative. There's a saying, that brevity is the soul of wit, and I think that some of these old modules, there's definitely a certain zeitgeist that they struck into at that point in time that really made they made these modules the classics that they are. And let's see what we got here. I don't let cheetahs at the. Oh, jeez, Mark, come on now, you're killing me. Um, but since we're talking cheetahs, I will mention a little bit about the about what I'm doing right now for that charity. Actually, I take that back. I see that Mr. Schick is coming back, so that we'll hold the phone on that one right now. Um, Welcome back, Mr. Schick.
Thank you.
Awesome. Please, again, going back to the White Plume Mountain and your feelings about it subsequent to fifth edition. Did you know any of that had happened?
I mean, they told me in advance they were going to do it. That's the extent, as far as they went. But first of all, let me just get right out there that I'm a big fan of fifth edition D&D. I think it's really it's not it ain't perfect, because how could it be? But I think it's an enormous achievement, and it deserves all of the success that it's been having in the last 5 years since it was published. And as far as the adaptation of White Plume Mountain to fifth edition in Tales from the Yawning Portal, I think that you ought to consider what Tales from the Yawning Portal is, right? It's pretty much a smorgasbord. It's a whole bunch of cool stuff just put together. Then you can take it or leave it. You can use what you want. You can use what you don't, and it doesn't hang together very well. And it's kind of White Plume Mountain writ large. It's a collection of cool stuff, and have a good time. And if some of it doesn't suit you, geez, there's plenty of other stuff in there. Just keep moving, and you'll find something 5 pages later that works fine. In that regard, I think White Plume Mountain is perfectly suited to be sitting in the middle of Tales from the Yawning Portal, because it's at home there with all this other stuff, cheek by jowl, that doesn't resemble it in any way, but it all works somehow if you take the parts that you want. So that's my answer.
I think when I think of that, the fact that it's included at all, that they chose White Plume Mountain out of all the hundreds and hundreds of modules that are out there, that speaks to its enduring qualities, actually. So, the other question I got that I thought was pretty incisive was, did Elric's people complain about Black Razor being Stormbringer, or was it left alone until deities and demigods with Melnibonian?
They never noticed.
You never noticed?
No. Why would they? Here's this little 12-page brochure published by a tiny hobby publisher in Wisconsin, in the upper Midwest of the United States, of all places. Who pays any attention to that stuff? It probably, it wasn't anything that was going to catch their attention, right? And it's not like Michael Moorcock didn't borrow a few ideas from other people. So it's not like any of those guys are in any position to be pointing fingers.
That's true. That's absolutely true. Now I'm looking over my shoulder again, and we're going to go back to the Castle Entertainment Library here. I'm going to bring up another module, and that would be in the Dungeons of the Slave Lords, which has also your name on it. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Slave Lords modules and your role in their creation and exactly what went into them. Go ahead and dish on the Slave Lords.
I mentioned Gary's competitiveness. Game conventions, were really important to him and to his friends. By the time that AD&D came along, probably disproportionately so, because the publication reach of the game was orders of magnitude greater than the hobby gaming the fanatics who would go to conventions. Who was us, right? Um, but but Gary had gotten into the tradition of there being a big Gen Con tournament every year, and it was going to determine who was best, because who was best was really important to him. So he was sure it must be important to other people too. So there had to be these big tournaments. So we had provided a tournament dungeon for 79, which became Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan. And Gary was really pleased with that. You know, here we had this cool tournament dungeon, and then we turned it into an AD&D module that sold a jillion copies. Let's do that, and let's do it 4 times as big for 1980, because now we have a bigger staff, and we're going to run a giant 4-stage tournament, and so we're going to need 4 scenarios linked together, and you guys are going to design them, and then we're going to turn them into a series, and we're going to sell a jillion copies. And so we said, okay. And we have to have them all done, you know, on a tight deadline because convention's coming. And I just thought of this now, and get to it. So, you know, it's spring 1980, and we thought we knew what the 1980 publishing schedule was going to be. And whoops, nope, you're wrong. You're doing 4 tournament dungeons right in the middle of it, and you're just jamming them in there. Get to work, boys. So we got together and discussed, you know, what can we do that would be, by this time, unlike just even a year earlier, right? By this time, coherence and storytelling and setting were suddenly important. It was the thing that was taken over, and it was undeniably the wave of the future. And so this thing had to be, it had to serve several masters, right? It had to be a multi-stage tournament dungeon, which could mean that everything was quantified and cut and dried and could be run in an hour, and you could track what people did and score them, and then move them all on into the next piece. And they might play the same characters and they might not. It didn't matter. It's a tournament. And then at the same time, it had to be this coherent story that was cohesive and hung together, and had recurring characters from section to section. And each one introduced new stuff, because that was every dungeon module had to have new monsters at that point. And so you had like 8 different requirements that each one of these modules had to, all these little check boxes that had to be ticked off. Well, you know, that was a lot of work, and we managed to do it. Of course, the thing is that since it had to be all things to all people, it had to be these tournament dungeons, and they also had to be these newfangled coherent storytelling modules. It didn't necessarily do all of them equally well. No. But you know, we did manage to check all the boxes off and get it done in time, and the tournaments were popular. So that's the origin of the A series, which I decided that it was going to be the A series because I was going to write one of them. Right. And if I was going to write a module for a series, that series was going to be the A series, so it would be listed first. So that's why it was the Eyrie of the Slave Lords. So it would be A1 through 4, so that our goddamn modules would come before anybody else's.
So that was directly intentional.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Again, that's something I absolutely never knew. Slave Lords, the dungeons. You're the primary writer on it. It may be the only writer on it. I'm not really sure, but
on number 4, yeah, that was on me.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about what you know, retrospectively, you're looking at it now. Things that you might have changed, things that you're proud of in particular. I know that my players weren't proud of the fact that they showed up at the beginning naked.
Yeah, well, keep in mind that this was the final stage of testing tournament players, and so the concept was, how do you test players, and test their skills and abilities, rather than test the stuff they're carrying. Well, take away their stuff. So that was an idea that I actually had frankly stolen from a dungeon that Harold Johnson had run in his campaign, where he took away all our stuff, and of course we hated it. You took away all our stuff. God damn it, Harold! Right. But it drove player problem solving in a way that was ideal for a tournament. And so that's why you've got these three sort of kind of standard modules, in the first 3/4 of the series, and then the fourth one just throws everything out the window and throws everybody into a dungeon and says, "All right, lads, let's see what you're made of without your fancy ass talking swords."
And that roper is nasty, by the way.
So yeah, and when we had to have some nasty new monsters. So what I would do different, of course, is that I would make the initial shock of taking away all the players' stuff, and of really taking away their agency, stealing their ability to make decisions by knocking them out and having them wake up somewhere. What a betrayal, right? Now, from a dramatic standpoint, I stand by the decision. It was worth doing, but I would provide a lot more guidance and advice to DMs on how to make their players like it. Right. It's a thing that wasn't done much at the time, right? And so we didn't see any need for it. And in retrospect, that was just wrong. We broke the mold, and when you break the mold, you need to help people along with it. So that's what I would do differently.
I have one of our viewers over here, our good friend David Leonard from Canada, is saying, one of the best modules ever, Home. Where's your ring of levitation now? So yeah, it's still, and for me, I like it because it's unique. It fits a niche in the pantheon of TSR modules that hadn't been filled at that point. And I personally love the fact that there's kind of a big spectrum of modules from TSR that you can choose from, and you're going to find something you like. So I really appreciate Slave Lords for that. And on a personal note, my company, Casl Entertainment, we do a lot of we run a lot of stuff that's Greyhawk with the numbers filed off, and in particular, your Store Roper and your Slave Lords inspired something very unpopular in one of my games. In our Marquesa series, I have something called the Prismatic Roper, which is a roper that has the ability to blend. It's kind of a camouflage roper. And boy, I took the idea. I was like, how can I improve on the Store Roper that Mr. Schick created? And when I created that thing, oh my goodness, that thing was brutal. But yeah, so you definitely inspired a whole new generation with that. Now going forward, moving away a little bit from TSR, when did you go ahead and you transition out of TSR?
Well, it was a difficult and multi-step thing, right? This is one of the many times when I have found myself in a perfect job that I loved, and I still felt that I had to leave it. And it just, yeah, that's the story of my career. And like I said, in 1980 when we did the A series and a bunch of other stuff. At that point, I was the head of the studio. I was calling the shots, and it was really uncomfortable being in a management position at that point, because that was where management friction was starting to get difficult. And that's stories that are told in lots of other places, so I won't go into them.
Right.
But I had gone there to design games, and I was designing at that time what was supposed to be the next, the really big game, Star Frontiers. Zeb and I were co-designing it, Zeb Cook, and at the same time, I was handling all these management tasks, and it was becoming really problematic, and I wasn't happy about it. And so I went to them and said, "Look, demote me. Just make me a designer, and let's have somebody else be the head of the studio. I don't want to do that stuff because I don't like the way things are going. But I'm, we're in the middle of these big projects, and we got to get these things done. Demote me, make me just a game designer, and we'll go ahead from that on that basis." So we did, and we completed. We turned in Star Frontiers. We did other stuff. I had done Deities, Demigods. I had pulled together Fiend Folio, and after finishing Star Frontiers, at that point, the studio was a lot different from how it had been just 2.5 years before, and a lot of the changes were things that I wasn't comfortable with. And at that time, I was a young, callow youth, footloose and fancy free. I was married, but I didn't have any children yet. So I said, well, I'm just gonna. I think we're done here. I think we've done what we want to do. Let's go off and do something else. I toyed around with doing other tabletop role playing stuff, and none of it, it had middling success. None of it particularly went anywhere. And then video games came along,
Right.
And so I said, "Aha! You know what? Here's something that I know nothing about, but I bet I can do this."
Now, between the two of them, though, is that not when Heroic Worlds was written?
No.
No, you actually did that while you were with DSR.
No, Heroic Worlds was written like 10 years later.
Oh, I see. I see. For some reason, I got my date mixed up there a little bit. We'll get to that in a second.
Heroic Worlds was why, look, here's a copy. Heroic Worlds was a side project that I did later on in my video game career when I was working at. It was early when I was working at Microprose in Maryland.
Okay, so tell us how you broke into video games then.
It was, when I mentioned Deities and Demigods, when we were putting that book together, I wanted to have each of the chapters have a consistent look. So we tried to have a lead artist assigned to each chapter who would establish the look and feel of the deities for that chapter, and it would then be more consistent than like the Monster Manual, for example, which had different art, 4 different artists per page, and so each of the artists who were on staff at that time, the archetypal early artists like Errol Otis and Bill Willingham and Jeff D and Dave Sutherland. Everybody got a chapter, and there were still some chapters left over. So I went looking for some freelancers to help us out, and I was really. One of the people who was out there who was doing really good work was Janelle Jaques. So I reached out and said, I would like you to do, I think you have the right feel in your art for the Nelwan chapter, for the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stuff, which turned out to be, that turned out to be good. And so we got to know each other, and when when Coleco started up, um, they knew that they wanted to do video games. They could see what Atari was doing, they could see what Mattel was doing, and wanted a piece of that. They didn't have any idea how to make games, and somehow Janelle Jaques and Mike Stackpole, who of course was one of the stalwarts of Flying Buffalo, doing Tunnels and Trolls stuff, persuaded them that, well, of course, if you're going to make games, you have to hire game designers. Well, this was this was bullshit. They totally just made this stuff up, talked their way through in the door, because nobody hired game designers at that point. Game designers didn't exist. Game designers were a few people at TSR and a few people at SPI, and a couple of folks at Flying Buffalo and a couple of people at Chaosium, and those were all the professional game designers in the world. And they persuaded Coleco that if they were going to make video games, they had to hire game designers.
Oh, we have a little bit of a freeze over here. Mr. Schick just froze up over here, his connection. While Mr. Schick is frozen right over here, I guess I inadvertently cast time stop on him. It's interesting to me that, again, you're going to hear this throughout this entire interview process. These guys are creating their own industry. I mean, they're the sense of entrepreneurship, the sense of these guys just they're striking out and doing something brand new is amazing to me. And it looks like we have totally lost Mr. Schick now, so I am going to go ahead and freeze him if you'll give me just a moment. And we'll talk about just me in specific here. Technical difficulties. It comes with the territory when it comes to Twitch, unfortunately. Mr. Schick is living currently over in Ireland. He mentioned to me earlier that they were having some connectivity problems over there with some throttling and some bandwidth stuff, so this was not totally unexpected. In any rate, going back to the conversation at hand, these guys are creating their own industry. They're working from whole cloth here, and the sense of being on a frontier of something new and doing something exciting, just, I think it's really cool that they were able to just, make, they made something here that is really enduring, and something that, something inspired all of us. I'm looking out there in my crowd right now, and I'm seeing a lot of first edition players, or at least early edition players. And I just I think to myself that where would we be without the giants here that we're standing on the shoulders of? Mr. Schick being one of them. We were when I was going to do the interview here, we were going to be talking at this point about his video game background. I have, we're probably about maybe 40 minutes left in the interview here, and I've yet to even discuss his background with Star Frontiers. We haven't talked too much about Heroic Worlds. There's so much that this man has done in his career, and it's one of the main reasons I really wanted him on the show, is that he's got a very, his background is super, super diverse. He's got a very unique career path, and I think he's one of one in the industry, where we're talking about a guy here who's done some very unusual stuff with his career, and so I think that it was one of the main reasons I wanted to bring him to you. I hope you guys have liked what he's had to say so far, or at least have been compelled by it. Looking back, hey, what's going on? Oh, Mr. Lowe, how you doing? It's good to see you over there. If that's the same Mr. Lowe, our one of Casl Entertainment's artists over here that I see down there. I see that the slavers got him. That's awesome. That's terrible. The Caraptus got him. Yeah, Mr. Schick's stuff has been extremely formative on me, as I mentioned during the interview. He inspired a lot of the stuff that I do right now in the Slave Lords. The prismatic roper that you'll see in Marquesa, Thy Name is Evil, is was inspired by seeing the store roper in Dungeons of the Slave Lords. So um, just that whole era over there that he represents and that he's discussing right over now. I mean, it's meat and drink to me. It definitely changed my life for the better. Much like Mr. Schick, uh, my career path personally, I've been in IT before for a long period of time, in addition to being a publisher. So I think that his story is very compelling to me in a lot of ways that may not be apparent on the surface. So uh, and yeah, Frontiersman, absolutely, and yeah, Marquesa. I thought she was dead. Well, you never know. I mean, there's always clones and resurrect in first edition. Uh, see, is there one more than one Low? Is Nick Lowe? Nick Lowe and the Tech Stones. I haven't thought of that band in a long time. Uh, I see a lot of discussion over here in the chat right now about Wizards and where they've gone and in fifth edition. Um, I should first start with the fact that I think that my personal view is that any D&D is good D&D. I think that I personally feel like as long as you're playing the game, I think Gary would smile on that at some level. Yeah, I know he wasn't necessarily happy with the direction that things went in certain aspects of the game, but I feel like we all honor him every time we open up a Dungeon Master's Guide, no matter what edition it is. If your players are enjoying it, if you're enjoying it, I don't think there's such a thing as bad, wrong, fun. I think it's a good thing that we're all continuing to play the game that he created. That was his passion. I think we go to Gary Con every year to celebrate him, and but I think we also celebrate him and his family and the things that he did and the things that he did for all of us personally. Because I know I'm not just speaking for myself when I tell you that how he changed my life. Um, I feel like I know that there's a lot of you out there who feel similarly. And when it talks about affection for the world of Greyhawk, when you're talking about the game itself, you're talking about some of the fun times, the people you've met, and the friendships you've formed. You know, I think that there's something to the fact that if he didn't invent it, somebody might have along the way, but he's the one that did it, and we owe a lot to him. Uh, I personally credit him with most of that. I look here at this chat right here. I look at Castle Entertainment. None of this would be possible. I wouldn't be friends with all of you if it wasn't for Gary. So we do a lot of things. We do a lot of things. You know, the things that we enjoy today, standing on the shoulders of giants for sure. And like I said, he's let's see. I think Mr. Schick will have to make a return. Yeah, I see that. Let's see. 4 was going back to chainmail. Yeah. I again, you're not necessarily wrong, Shedzar. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that regardless of his feelings about particular editions or rule sets or the way things eventuated with the company with TSR, for sure there was a lot of bitterness there, and I think a lot of it was justified. But by the same token, I do feel like that by playing Dungeons and Dragons, you know, we celebrate the man that he was, and I definitely place first edition still. So you're preaching to the choir a little bit there, but I do think that new players when they come along, if it's not for the newer editions, I talk a lot about this with Greyhawk fans, and I wonder about what's going to happen to Greyhawk, the future of Greyhawk after my generation and Lawrence Schick's generation and people's generation like that. What's going to happen to Greyhawk when we're gone? Without official wizard support, is it just going to die away? Is it just going to be Forgotten Realms? Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. But I do know this: D&D will live forever because of official support, and it's new editions that continue that. And you know, 15 years down the road, these people may not care about first edition. They may not know really cognitively who Gary Gygax was or what his contributions were or what he meant, but I can tell you that the fact that they're all gathering around a table and they're enjoying each other's company and the adventures that they had, his spirit somewhere out there in the outer plains has to smile on that at some level. Um, I think it's telling that his son Luke plays fifth edition with the daughters. Um, I, I I really I think I think that's the best way to celebrate his accomplishments in his life. Um, Now Greyhawk over here, we're looking down here. Somebody else mentions Greyhawk is dead. Well, I don't know. I don't know about that. I mean, if you look at Castle Entertainment products, I'm looking at 20 modules on my wall right over now that say maybe that's not true. Uh, I have to file the numbers off of them to print them and publish them. Yeah, I can't call it the Woolly Bay. I have to call it the Fleecy Bay. I can't call it Greyhawk. I have to call it the Free City. Um, yeah, that's true. It's a pain in the ass, and I'll be the first to admit to you, I don't like doing that at all. I mean, it kills a little bit of my soul every time I have to write that. I have to write Our Lady instead of Istis. But by the same token, it's what I love. It's a setting I love, and I'm committed to bringing it to you and continuing on. Um, I'll never be the writer Gary was. I'll never be the writer that half of the giants that we talk about were. Um, but at the same token, I can only do what I can do, and I try my best to bring everybody the best Greyhawk content I can that I'm capable of creating for you. You may hate it, you may like it, you may think it's not for you, and that's fine. It doesn't really, your reaction to it, as far as whether you can use it or not, as long as it inspires something in you, as long as there's something that you can take away from it using your game, whether you're like, yeah, I don't really like the fact that Carlos did this, but there's this one little piece of it I thought was really cool that he did that maybe I can use in one of my games, man, that's all I care about. And in that, I think Gary's spirit will carry on. I think Greyhawk will carry on as far as that goes. We're talking on Facebook a lot lately about whether Wizards' support of Greyhawk is a good or a bad thing. Um, yeah, that's for everybody out there to decide. I just know that I love Greyhawk, and so I've got to keep doing what I can do to keep it alive. Um, Maybe it's dead for official support. Who knows? I mean, Joe Block seems to think so, and he's probably in a better position to judge that than I am. For example, if you follow Greyhawk Gronyard, you'll say, "Oh, we have somebody coming back. Hold on for a second. We have Lawrence Schick back. Let me reformat the screen here. Mr. Schick, welcome back.
Hi, sorry. It's our local internet. It wasn't built to handle a pandemic.
You mentioned that. Just give me a second to get you on the screen properly. There is my man, Lawrence Schick. And I will get him on the screen. I was pontificating about Greyhawk's existence while you were gone. We were talking
okay.
I talked a little bit about cheetahs and things like that too. So I'm glad you're back. Because nobody really wants to hear me pontificate. We were in the midst of talking about your genesis in the career and how you and Janelle and people of that ilk had managed to cut a niche for yourselves in the video game industry by sort of making a position.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. I'm not sure exactly where I dropped out, but the point is that Janelle and Mike Stackpole persuaded the folks at Coleco that in order to make video games that they would need to have game designers. And Mike wasn't too sure that he wanted really to make a career out of that. And so that they brought me in to sort of gradually fill in that other game designer role there. And the point was that, of course, we weren't programmers. And the only way that video games were made in 1982 and 1981 was you had a programmer who might work with another couple of other people who would help them out. But the programmer did everything. Everything was done in machine code right down in the chip level.
Right.
And what we did at Coleco was basically because we weren't programmers, we persuaded them to invent the idea of the video game staff, which didn't exist before. So we persuaded them, well, if you're going to make video games, you got to have a game designer, of course, because you're designing a game. Right. And it's visual, so you got to have artists. You got to hire artists and not just have programmers do the art, because they're not artists, they're programmers.
Sure.
And of course, it's audio visual. So you need to have a music person. You need to have somebody who can make the little 8-bit deep doop 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 stuff, because that you need a musician for that. You can't just have some programmer make deep doop doots. That has to be written. And so and then you need to have. We're going to publish manuals with these things, because that's what you still did back then, because there was no internet. So you need to have technical writers to write the manuals. So we invented at Coleco the entire idea of having a video game staff of people and of teams of people who built games from different disciplines coming together. Rather than just having a central programmer / game designer / artist who borrowed some additional help from other folks as they needed them. So we kind of backed into inventing a whole new business. So that turned out to be really useful, because then we hired other people from the game design business. Dennis Sestair, Kevin Hendricks, other people who'd worked in paper games. And it turned out, because our instincts actually were correct, their instincts were, the way games work, the way paper games work, board games, role-playing games, whatever, they're all these if-then propositions, and they're all different synergies of interacting mathematical systems. And computer programs are the same thing down at the basic level. And so it turned out that the story that we sold them, that they needed game designers in order to make their video games, turned out to be a true story, on that basis. And so when we started bringing in paper game designers into the video game business, and their skills mapped directly onto video game design. And then they started spreading out into different areas, folks from who had been in role playing games like Paul Ritchie and Evan Robinson. They went off and started making games for EA, and I spent the next 10 years basically hiring people out of the paper game industry into the video game industry, and putting teams together for different publishers.
Well, I can tell you that having been a video game junkie at that time in my life, that I had just about all the major consoles at that point in time, and Coleco was by far my favorite. I thought it was the best of them. So you were doing something right, definitely, as far as that goes. You worked with AOL afterwards as an executive, but there's something I want to touch on in your video game industry that happened afterwards, which is Elder Scrolls. It's got to be one of the most popular. It's certainly probably the most popular fantasy video game series out there. And you were the lore master, correct?
I was the lore master of the online MMO game. Yes, okay. Elder Scrolls Online.
How does it's got to be super gratifying knowing that you've contributed to something that is as amazingly popular worldwide and beloved as Elder Scrolls is. I mean,
it was another one of those perfect jobs that kind of molded itself right around exactly what I was good at. That came like 20 years later. The single player games all came first. In the Elder Scrolls series, Daggerfall and Morrowind and Oblivion and eventually Skyrim. Though Skyrim we were well under development before Skyrim came out. It was really great to be involved with that franchise. And here's the thing: that franchise is based upon tabletop role-playing games. It started out being some of the guys at Bethesda's D&D campaigns turned into video games, and it started getting really interesting and weird with the second one, Daggerfall, and then it became really world class with Elder Scrolls 3, which was Morrowind. Now, the lead designer on Morrowind was a guy named Ken Ralston, who was originally a paper game designer. He was a guy who I'd gotten to know in the 80s, and I sought him out because he did really excellent Star Frontiers modules and a bunch of other really good design work for other tabletop gamers. And then later on, when I was right before I went to AOL, I was at a studio in Washington D.C. called Magnet Interactive Studios, and I was still, as I said, making a career out of hiring people from the paper game business into the video game business, and it was at Magnet where we're once again putting together another studio, having to hire up a whole bunch of people. Needed game designers. Where do you go? You go to the paper game business, and so that's where I persuaded Zeb Cook and Ken Ralston to come into the video game business. Was at Magnet in the early '90s, and then Ken went up the street to Bethesda Softworks and became lead designer on Morrowind, and on Oblivion. And then he went to work on another role-playing game that eventually became Kingdoms of Amalur: The Reckoning, and that's when he pulled me back into the video game business at that point in the '90s, and then I went from there over up the road to the new ZeniMax Online studio. So it's this web of people who all knew each other and all had similar backgrounds and had a basis back in all the original tabletop role-playing days, and learned the trade back when we were inventing that new business.
It's really amazing how the network developed as far as that goes. I've got one of my viewers here who has taken me to task, and I'm definitely wrong for doing this. Where he says you can't mention AOL and gloss over it without mentioning Neverwinter Nights. So, yeah, you want to talk about that?
Well, Neverwinter Nights was one of the it was one of the foundational multiplayer games of the online role-playing business.
Yeah.
It was the first one that was really graphical in a big way, and it was already there at AOL when I got to AOL in 1995.
Right.
They had the original Neverwinter Nights, and it was this little tiny niche thing off to the side that was with these incredibly fanatical players.
Right.
And it wasn't really very important to AOL. When we founded the games channel for AOL, we had sort of hardcore games like Neverwinter Nights, but really what we were there to do was to invent the online casual gaming industry for the millions of AOL players. And that's where that's where the major part of the business went.
I see.
But we did have Neverwinter Nights as a template to work that with a few other publishers to figure out how to make online role-playing work in a ever larger and more massive way. And so we gave them the connections to people and fed new players into them, and then a whole lot of innovation came from that. And of course, by the time I left AOL, right before I left, we had brought on Ultima Online, which was the big breakthrough product.
Right.
And bringing that onto AOL was actually what we turned the fire hose of players from AOL onto Ultima Online, and that's what kicked that off. And so that's where the whole online role playing game business came from.
And now with your current project, and I know you can't really talk too much about it right now. I think my major question is, you've done so many different things. Your career path has had this amazing, fascinating arc to it. Are you happy? Are you happy with the way things turned out?
As a matter of fact, I am. Yeah, I'm having a great time. As I mentioned to you before we started, I'm back in a small studio in an entrepreneurial environment. I had been at ZeniMax Online for almost 10 years as one of their lead writers and lore master on Elder Scrolls Online. That was great. That was the best job I ever had, and I was doing the same thing, year after year, and I was really good at it, and it was a lot of fun, and it was really exciting, and it was time to do something else, because I'm in my 60s, and you can't do the same thing all the time because otherwise you turn to stone. So I had to get, this opportunity came along, and so now I'm working on a small team, designing a mobile game that takes in all of the various things that I've worked on in the past. And I get to do 6 different things every day and wear different hats and all the time answering questions and solving problems we're inventing new stuff again. We're making up a new thing that I can't go into the details on, but we're not just we're not copying another product on the market. We are breaking ground, and it's I'm having a great time doing it. And it's the mass market. There's no sure thing ever. We could go out and disappear without a ripple. But we're inventing stuff, and that's what it's all about.
In an industry where there's so much that's derivative, and you feel like sometimes you play the same game or you're just playing a skin of it or something like that, the fact that you're saying breaking new ground, it just warms my heart. And I would expect nothing else from a guy who spent his entire career breaking new ground to say something like that. I mean, that's just great. I've got a friend of mine out here, chatting royalty for Greyhawk, J. Scott Lord Gasumba, who mentions that first gen was so cool. They're talking about Neverwinter, and it says first gen was so cool for its time, all in hex code. Some really cool stuff out there, and I've got my wife out here, Amanda Ruse, mentioning that can't wait to find out what it is, your new project, and she's speaking for me there because you've got me. I think the whole mystery of it is amazing. I'm really excited to see what you're going to do.
Well, we'll be, it's an online game because everything's an online game now. So online games get released gradually. So we're going to be, it's going to be gradually rolling out at various levels of testing over the next year, and you'll be hearing from me.
We've got about 15 minutes left in the chat, so anybody out there who wants to chime in with some questions or for Mr. Schick, please absolutely go ahead. In the meantime, I'm going to hit 2 of them. One of them comes from my good friend David Leonard in Canada, who mentioned this particular document over here. This would be the 25-year White Plume Mountain return module.
Right.
He said that he missed a little bit of the chat at the beginning when we were talking about Yawning Portal. So I wanted to get your thoughts about return, how you felt like the module was adapted and expanded. What'd you think? There's a whole new artifact in it. We know more about Craptus now.
It was a product that came as a complete surprise to me. So, okay. So I didn't know they were doing it. It was designed for the D&D of that time, and I have no idea how well it did or anything about it, really. So I regret to say that I don't really have any comments on that particular product.
And that's totally fine. You can't know everything about them all. My new friend out here, Antiquitous, is mentioning, he dovetails perfectly with the next question, because it's a question I wanted to ask, which is Star Frontiers. Tell me about Star Frontiers, its creation a little bit. Some of the things you liked about it and didn't like about it. And I have a particular question about the universal table for it. So please go ahead.
Okay. All right. So, Star Frontiers. Um, uh, TSR was, did I mention Gary's competitiveness? When he saw the success of Traveler from GEW, which was, those guys did a great job, and it looked professional. It was sharp. It didn't look ragged like some of the TSR stuff that we were still, churning out at the time. It had a consistent look and feel to it that was very impressive. And Gary was jealous. He wanted the biggest science fiction game. So Zeb Cook and I were the two lead designers at the studio at that point, and so we said, give us this assignment. Let us design the big TSR science fiction role playing game that is going to go head to head with Traveler. And furthermore, this was right at the time when Star Wars had just hit a couple of years earlier, and Star Trek was what we grew up on, and there was a significant Star Trek RPG out there as well, so our brief was. Go out and capture the science fiction mass market, whatever the hell that is,
right?
As represented by Star Wars and Star Trek. So we said, okay, well, we were both science fiction fans from being knee high. So we said, we're the guys to do this. What are we going to do? Well, because we're game designers, we're going to go backwards. We're going to figure out how the game works and how that's going to work out best for the players, and then we will sort of map the worlds and the universe onto the way the game works. And so we came up with with what we thought was a pretty good stat-based system that was based on D20s, and was pretty darn flexible, and it was also skill-based rather than class-based, and we had the different alien races because people like to play aliens, and so you want to have ones that are familiar and ones that are weird. So we tried to hit all those buttons. The thing about science fiction as compared to fantasy, what makes science fiction hard, is that fantasy is about archetypes. You throw some dragons and monsters and Pegasus and unicorn in there, and people know what to expect.
Sure.
There's knights, there's wizards. They know how that stuff works, right? Science fiction doesn't work that way at all. In science fiction, a good science fiction story is really about one idea and figuring out the consequences, intended and unintended, of what this one big idea is. So we had to come up with a science fiction universe that would be familiar enough to the Star Wars and Star Trek players that they would find the stuff that they were looking for in it. But it had to be internally consistent on its own basis. And so we had to figure out what science worked and what did you have anti-gravity? Did you have matter figure out all that stuff. Okay. So we spent a year and we did that. And we came up with a game that was comparable in its complexity to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons at the time. So it was not that introductory a game. And then TSR decided, based upon the success of the basic and expert sets, which were also stuff that Zeb and I had put together for D&D, that really they wanted the game to be more introductory and more basic, and that's where your universal table came from, right? That was retcon
I
in
see.
the original design. Now, right after the time that we finished the original design of the game, that was when I decided it was time for me to move on. So we turned in the game. There was some wrangling, and then I left, and then Zeb and Harold Johnson and other folks went and revised the game to meet the new requirements of the product. And I really didn't have anything to do with those changes. So, and some of them were more successful than others, and I'll just leave it at that.
Right. You may have noticed a few moments ago I was looking over my shoulder. I was going to pull out my copy of Zebulon's Guide to Frontier Space, and then I realized for a moment that I was like, it's really not all that relevant. But one thing I do think about Star Frontiers. There's two things actually when I think about Star Frontiers that jump to my mind right away. And the first thing is that the Universal Table hits me right away, because right after that, you'll see it in Marvel Superheroes. You'll see it in Indiana Jones. There's a lot of TSR stuff that uses that universal table concept. And now that I know that actually it wasn't the original concept for it, I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with the idea of a universal table. And really what you were seeing there in that first version of Star Frontiers is TSR grappling with that idea in its first implementation. It got a lot better later.
Right. And the other thing I think about when I think about Star Frontiers is, how gratified do you feel that you invented the cell phone when you guys came up with the body comp? Because that is, every time I pick up my cell phone, the first thing I think of to myself is, oh, I've got my body comp on me right now.
Yeah, no. And it was there's nothing in Star Frontiers that we didn't harvest out of pre-existing science fiction ideas. I'm pretty darn sure.
Yeah, but I since that was so formative for me, I think about that is the first touchstone for me. Every time I see myself, I was like, oh, got my body cap today. I'm good. Now, another one of our audience members, Mark Clover, asked, how inspiring is living in Ireland to your creative process?
I love Ireland. It's great. It's obviously obviously I care about European history, right? So it's great. Why didn't I move to Europe earlier? What the hell was I thinking? It's the perfect sort of combination of modern and old, of familiar and unfamiliar. The people are great. It's a sensible place. They've come recently to the idea of liberal democracy, and they haven't got tired of it yet. So it's a good place to be right now.
That's good. That's awesome, and I'm glad that it's inspiring. Are you a dual citizen, primary citizen?
I'm still an American citizen. Dual citizenship is a thing that takes a while. I'm an American citizen working in Ireland on as an essential personnel work visa.
Okay, cool. I think this last question I've gotten from my audience is probably, I wanted to close on this one because I think it's really probably a good question to end on, is you've got this massive spectrum of things that you've done, this great body of work, and so diverse. What is the one thing that you would say you're most proud of in the games industry, whether it be video games, role-playing games? What is the one thing that we should know that Lawrence Schick was most proud of?
Oh gosh. Yeah, we're gonna save that for my obituary, I think.
So it hasn't been done yet. It hasn't been done yet.
No, I'm certainly not done. I'm still doing new stuff. I didn't even touch on my time working with Sid Meier at Microprose.
I know. There's so much I was telling everybody in the audience when you were gone that there's so much I wanted to get to, but I also promised you that I'd get you out of here in 2 hours. So,
Okay, so let me just mention
okay.
that I'm the only person in the business who has worked closely with both Gary Gygax and Sid Meier. So there's that. Um, and they were both extremely educational. Let me tell you. Anyway, I'm very proud of, particularly of one of the. I did the follow-up game to Sid Meier's Pirates, which was a game called Sword of the Samurai. That did a whole lot of, that was prescient of later designs in a lot of ways, that I'm very pleased with that. I want to get a mention on that thing. Oh gosh, what else? I think we've hit most of the high points. I mean, really, what I have been and done is I've never been the Gary Gygax or the Sid Meier myself, right? I have I have been fortunate in that I have managed to be in a lot of places at a lot of times where I got to be the hinge on the door, as it were. I got to take all of the previous stuff that I had done and use that to help a new thing get born. And then, it was time to go do something else because I did that already. And, there's that thing over there. It looks really shiny and fun. Let's go do that. That's kind of been the story of my career, and I'm still doing that. So that's, I guess, is who I am.
When there's a common denominator between successful products, whether it be D&D or whether it be Sid Meier's stuff or whether it be what you're doing right now or Neverwinter Nights or Elder Scrolls, I think that you have to give some credence to maybe that's a little bit more important than, and it seems to me that you're the common denominator in a lot of these things. I think that you've brought a lot of value to these things, and um, I think that's a good place for us to leave this right now. Thank you, everybody. I'm actually getting a lot of comments right now for uh, everybody wants you to come back. So, yeah, I'm really glad that you could do this with us, Mr. Schick. It was really, I've learned a lot actually that I didn't know previously about yourself and about the gaming world in general. And I consider myself that I know a lot about some of the old TSR days and things like that. But you've illuminated a lot of things to me I didn't know. So that was a great chat, and I'm glad that you could do this with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Stick
Have
around
fun,
for just
gamer.
a few more moments after we sign off, and so I can say a proper goodbye to you. But I'm sorry I didn't
Okay.
mean to cut you off. What were you gonna say?
I was just, saying farewell to everyone, and maybe I'll see you again.
Okay, absolutely. Everybody out there in Twitch, thanks for tuning in for caslTawk again. From Mr. Schick, I'm Carlos A.S. Lising, Casl Entertainment. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next time. Bye now.
Bye.